ओके सर, नमस्कार। स्वागत है आपका आपके इस बैच में। टुडे आई एम गोइंग टू टॉक अबाउट द लास्ट पोएट ऑफ रेनेसांस, द पोएट हु इज आल्सो नोन एज द लास्ट चाइल्ड ऑफ रेनेसांस, जिसको लास्ट चाइल्ड ऑफ रेनेसांस भी कहा जाता है। एंड हिज नेम इज जॉन मिल्टन। John Milton is called the last child of Renaissance. And why is he called the last child of Renaissance? Because he was the last great poet of that great century, of that great period. उसके last poet हैं। Milton started his career as a poet, as a writer during the reign of Charles I, that is also known as Caroline period, and almost his life was जो है full of upheaval, political upheavals and religious upheavals. And Milton proved himself a genius. He was in support of Commonwealth government during the Civil War. He was in support of Parliament, and when the Commonwealth government was formed, he became the Latin secretary. He became the civil servant in the Commonwealth government, and later under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. Right? तो Oliver Cromwell के उसमें भी ये शामिल हुए. He was a political as well as an academic person. He was highly educated. बहुत ज्यादा इन्होंने पढ़ाई की थी. And it is said that he became blind in 1652. And how he became blind? Because of his high and hard studies. Excessive studies के वजह से his eyesight was lost. उनकी आंख कमजोर हो गई, और आंख कमजोर होने का नतीजा ये हुआ कि he became completely blind in 1652. And after that blindness, he wrote the greatest, one of the greatest epics in English, and that is known as Paradise Lost. And Milton is especially remembered for that Paradise Lost. Clear? तो इसीलिए उनको last child कहा जाता है, because he was the last great poet of the century. He was the last great poet of his age, इसलिए उनको great जो है last child of Renaissance कहा जाता है. And after during the lifetime of John Milton, he was very much appreciated by his contemporary poets, and after his death he was revered by Wordsworth, he was revered by Thomas Hardy, and he was revered by other romantic and Victorian poets, and he is still remembered because of his hardship and because of his magnificent Paradise Lost, the epic, जिसके लिए ये जाने जाते हैं. रंजना मौर्य, रेणु यादव, उत्कर्ष सचेटीवाल, एवरीवन इज वेरी वेरी जो है, सभी का स्वागत है, सभी को गुड आफ्टरनून है, और सभी को शाम वाली गुड मॉर्निंग भी. राइट? तो जॉन मिल्टन born in 1609 and died in 1674. Born in 1609 and died in 1674. He was born during the reign of James I, जिसको Jacobean age कहा जाता है, and he died in 1674 when Charles II was the king, and that period is called the Restoration period. And James I and Charles II both belonged to the same dynasty, and that dynasty is called Stuart dynasty. So it could be said that Milton was a poet during the Stuart dynasty, and Milton was one of the founding members of Puritan. Right? Puritan poet कहा जाता है मिल्टन को. Puritan age के poet है मिल्टन. And who is a Puritan? Puritan is one who seeks purity in all spheres of life, whether it is literature, whether it is culture, whether it is morality. जहां पर हर जगह जो प्योरिटी को ही सीख करता है, प्योरिटी को ही सर्च करता है, उसी को बोला जाता है प्योरिटन. and Milton was a Puritan. Right? Milton खुद ही जो है Puritan है. He was not an Elizabethan poet. He was not born and brought up during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. But after William Shakespeare, Mr. Milton is second greatest poet of the period. Right? Second greatest period में हम मिल्टन का ही नाम जो है रखते हैं, मिल्टन को ही जाना जाता है. Clear? Though when Milton started writing, poets like John Donne, poets like Ben Jonson, they were also writing great poetry, great poems. But Milton established himself as the unique writer, as the unique poet. Right? He surpassed the metaphysical school of poetry as well as the tribes of Ben Caroline poetry. दोनों को सरपास करते हैं मिल्टन. Right? In while at Cambridge Christ College, he was the most handsome student, and because of that he is called, क्या कहा जाता है इनको? He is called Lady of Christ. Christ being the name of his college, Christ College. Lady of Christ के नाम से भी इनको जाना जाता है. Christ was the name of his college, and because of his beauty, इनको Lady of Christ के नाम से भी जाना जाता है. Right? John Milton was born in London in 1608. Right? 1609 हमने लिख दिया है. 9 में मिल्टन का जो है बर्थ होता है कि 8 में मिल्टन का बर्थ होता है. Actually, Milton was born in the last month of 1608 on 9th December 1608. 9th December 1608, and his father was a lawyer come banker, and in easy circumstances, and though a Puritan, was a lover of art and a lover of literature. So Milton got literature, Milton got art, विरासत में इनको मिला था. इनके फादर जो है, he was interested in art, he was interested in literature, though he was also a Puritan. Right? Puritan के बावजूद. And same thing happened with John Milton. John Milton was also a Puritan, but he excelled in literature, he excelled in art. Right? He was and his father, beside being a Puritan and besides being a banker and lawyer, he had a deep interest in music as well. तो म्यूजिक जो है मिल्टन को वो भी विरासत में ही मिली थी. While at Cambridge, he composed many Latin and Italian poems. Milton not only wrote in English, but Milton also wrote in French. Milton also wrote in Latin. Milton also wrote in Italian. राइट? मिल्टन ने जो है कई भाषाओं में जो है पोएट्री लिखी है. बट द ओनली रिमार्केबल इंग्लिश पोएम ऑफ द पीरियड इज हिज ओड ऑन क्राइस्ट्स नेटिविटी. राइट? ओड ऑन क्राइस्ट नेटिविटी is the most important poem of that period. Milton's age is generally divided into 3 parts for the sake of studies, for the sake of convenience. The first period is known as Cambridge period, and the second period is known as Horton period, and the third period जो है उसको क्या कहा जाता है? The third period is known as journalistic period. And there are some of the historians who divide Milton's life into 4 parts. First one is Cambridge, second one is Horton, third one is his journalistic period, and the fourth one is called his last period, and last period of his great achievement. Right? Just I write the names of those 4 periods of Milton's life. जो मिल्टन के लाइफ के 4 पीरियड हैं वो कौन कौन से हैं? When he was a student at Christ College, उसको क्या कहा जाता है? That is known as Cambridge period. कैम्ब्रिज पीरियड। एंड द कैम्ब्रिज पीरियड जो है कहां से कहां तक शुरू होता है? द कैम्ब्रिज पीरियड which closes in 1632, right? He did his BA and his MA, right, from Cambridge University. In 1628 he completed his BA, and in 1632 he completed his MA. So from the beginning to 1632, this period is called Cambridge period, when he was a student at Cambridge University. And then he went to Horton, and the Horton period starts in 1632 and it closes in 1638. Horton period. (1632) and 1638. And during this Horton period, he wrote his greatest elegy, Lycidas, on the death of his friend Edward King. Right? Lycidas is a pastoral elegy जो इन्होंने लिखा था during his Horton period. And the third period is known as journalistic period, when he became a pamphleteer. When he became a pamphleteer, and when he wrote his essay, when he delivered his speech in parliament against the licensing act, जिसको एरोपेजेटिका कहा जाता है. एरोपेजेटिका was written in 1643 and it was delivered to the parliament in 1644, right? And he wrote a few more pamphlets during this journalistic period, and this journalistic period starts from 1630, and from 1630 to 1660 he kept on writing pamphlets, he kept on writing essays against the government and in support of the parliament, right? In support of Oliver Cromwell, he kept on writing from 1630 to 1660, right? And in 1660 Commonwealth government was overthrown, and then restoration period starts, and in the restoration period the monarchy was restored, and Milton suffered the comeuppance of his work जो उन्होंने किया था during the Commonwealth period. He had supported the regicide, he had welcomed the murderers, the killers of king, और इसका जो है खामियाजा भी उनको भुगतना पड़ा, but he had become blind, and for that reason he was shown mercy, right? And the third or the last period is the period of his great achievement, when his famous poem Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, and a few other works, Samson Agonis, were published, right? That is called the fourth period, the period of achievement. Right, so this is the summary. This is these are the periods जिसमें हम मिल्टन के लाइफ को स्पैन कर सकते हैं, जिसमें हम मिल्टन के लाइफ को स्पैन करते हैं, जो हमको हिस्टोरियंस ने, क्रिटिक्स ने दिया है, राइट? लेट्स टॉक अबाउट द फर्स्ट पीरियड, और फर्स्ट पीरियड है कैम्ब्रिज पीरियड. बिसाइड्स सम इंग्लिश पोएम्स, इंग्लिश पोएट तो मिल्टन थे ही. Milton wrote many poems in Latin and Italian, which can now be read in English translations. They are interesting exercises of a promising but immature genius. This was the beginning of his career, and during when he started his career as a poet, he was not an English poet, but he was an Italian and Latin poet, and in his early poems, we see the symptoms of his innocence, we see the symptoms of his immaturity. He was not as mature as he became after 1640s, right? That was the initial phase, and in initial phase, a poet devoid of experience, ऐसा ही होता है, और मिल्टन भी ऐसे ही थे. Though he started writing राइटिंग उन्होंने शुरू कर दिया। एंड द फर्स्ट पोएम दैट ही रोट वाज ऑन हिज ग्रेट मास्टर, और वो थे विलियम शेक्सपियर। उन्हीं पर इन्होंने पहली पोएम अपनी लिखी भी थी, दैट वाज इन इंग्लिश, राइट। शेक्सपियर पर इन्होंने लिखी थी। एंड इन कैम्ब्रिज पीरियड ही रोट ओज ऑन क्राइस्ट्स nativity, a much publicized and a much famous ode, and you should know the name because in your examination only name can be asked, right? Who wrote ode on Christ's nativity? And it was John Milton who wrote. And when was the ode written? The ode was written in his Cambridge period, right? Cambridge period में ode लिखा गया था। And this ode is also known as Nativity Ode. Also known as Nativity Ode, right? It is an excellent performance for a young man of 21, but is hardly worth the extravagant praise lavished upon it by some enthusiasts. It speaks well of Milton's devotion to the person of the infant Christ, but is marked by exaggerations and conceits in Donne's manner, right? Or actually, when he started writing, it was the prime time of Milton, and it was the prime time of John Donne. And John Donne is remembered, John Donne is known for his metaphysical conceits, right? And this ode was full of metaphysical conceits, and that those metaphysical conceits in fact made this poem a bit difficult for the common man to understand, right? John Donne's metaphysical conceits were also not comprehensible, were also not they were also incomprehensible for common man, and so was the case with Milton in the beginning of his career. So the very one poem that you have to remember for your examination from the Cambridge period, और Cambridge period की जो poem है उसका नाम उसका नाम जो है वो है Ode on Christ's Nativity, राइट? उसको ओड ऑन क्राइस्ट नेटिविटी के नाम से जाना जाता है। Right, Milton's poetry was slow to see the light of day, at least under his name. His first published poem was on Shakespeare. His first published poem was on Shakespeare. ये उनकी फर्स्ट पब्लिश्ड पोएम थी, एंड दिस पोएम वाज पब्लिश्ड इन 1629. This poem was published in 1629, right? Anonymously published हुई थी, included in the second folio edition of William Shakespeare's plays in 1632. In the first edition of Shakespeare's plays, that is called first folio, वहां पर द पोएम दैट वाज प्रीफिक्स्ड वो कौन सी थी? वो बेन जॉनसन की पोएम थी, राइट? दैट ही रोट इन ऑनर ऑफ, इन मेमोरी ऑफ विलियम शेक्सपियर. एंड हियर द सेकंड एडिशन जो है शेक्सपियर प्ले का, दैट इज आल्सो नोन एज सेकंड फोलियो, पब्लिश्ड इन 1632. और 1632 के एडिशन में दिस पोएम ऑन शेक्सपियर वाज अपेंडेड, और ये पोएम जो पहली बार जब छपी देन इट वाज एनोनिमस, राइट? एनोनिमस पोएम पब्लिश हुई थी 1632 में. एंड फिर an annotated copy of the first folio has been suggested to contain marginal notes by Milton. Milton collected his works in 1645 poems in the mid of the excitement attending the possibility of establishing a new English government. The anonymous edition of Camus was published in 1637, and the publication of Lycidas in 1638 in Justa Edorta King Defargio. राइट, चलिए आते हैं उनके अगली पोयम पर। अगला पीरियड जो है उनका, जिसको हम हॉटन पीरियड के नाम से जानते हैं। हॉटन पीरियड, लीविंग असाइड द इनसिग्निफिकेंट मार्क्स ऑफ द पीरियड, और इनसिग्निफिकेंट मार्क्स ऑफ द पीरियड जो था वो आर्किडीज। जस्ट अ मिनट, हेलो हेलो, राइट। हॉटन पीरियड की जहां तक बात है तो आर लीविंग असाइड द इनसिग्निफिकेंट मास आर्किडीज, द फोर पीसेस ऑफ दिस पीरियड आर द मोस्ट डिलाइटफुल ऑफ मिल्टन्स पोएट्री। Had Milton written nothing else, his El Alighiero and El Penseroso, Camus and Lycidas would have been enough to place him in the front rank of English poets. So Houghton period was the witness of his four great pieces of poetry. El Alighiero, El Penseroso, Camus and Lycidas. These four works were published during the Houghton period, and had Milton written nothing else, his El Alighiero and El Penseroso, Camus and Lycidas would have been enough to place him in the front rank of English poets. जो पहली दो poems हैं El Alighiero and El Penseroso, they are also known as twin poems. El Alighiero and El Penseroso are Italian in title but English in spirit. El Alighiero and El Penseroso, the title is from Italy, Italian title. El Alighiero means the happy man and El Penseroso means the pensive man, the thoughtful man. Right? El Alighiero means the happy man and El Penseroso means the pensive man or the thoughtful man. Right? El Alighiero and El Penseroso are Latin titles, but they are English in spirit. They present contrasted pictures of the scholarly Milton, first in his gayer and then in his graver mood. Right? The first poem is written in his gayer mood, in his happier mood, and second poem was written in his pensive mood, in his philosophical mood, in his pensive mood. The first two poems, El Alighiero and El Penseroso, the companion poems, the twin poems, are the two phases of Milton's life. Once when he was gay, when he was happy, and the other one when he was in a thoughtful mood. Right? Written in tripling octosyllabic couplet. This question has been asked many times. Right? Which are the two companion poems? Then you now know the answer. El Alighiero and El Penseroso are the companion poems, and they are written in octosyllabic couplet. Right? They are written in octosyllabic couplet. Octosyllabic couplet, कपलेट जिसको आप जानते हो जनरली हीरोइक कपलेट होता है, and heroic couplets are written in decasyllabic couplet. Right? 10 syllable decasyllabic couplet होते हैं, and octosyllabic couplet means 8 syllable के couplet हैं वो. Right? Both the poems are written in octosyllabic couplets. Their hunting music is a permanent position, right? El Eligaro means the cheerful man, the happy man, right? और इसी में एक में वो जो है शेक्सपियर को डिफाइन करते हैं आवर फैंसीज चाइल्ड, कि फैंसी का चाइल्ड है शेक्सपियर, कल्पनाओं का है। क्लियर? चलिए नेक्स्ट वर्क जो है उनका कामू। कामू इज अ मास्क। Mask was a genre related to drama, and during the Jacobean period, masks were very much famous, and initially masks were written by Ben Jonson, and they were designed by a designer named Inigo Jones. Masks are highly elaborated plays. The characters of masks are not professionals, they are amateur characters, and masks were performed inside the court in the palace of kings and queens, and sometimes kings and queens also participated in masks. They used to act in masks, right? So it was not a professional play, it was not publicly performed, but it was performed by the amateur characters, by the kings and queens, and it generally took place inside the court, inside the palace, right? And in the same way, Milton का जो mask है, right, it is written as Camus, but it is pronounced, it is written as Comus, but it is pronounced as Camus, right? Camus जो है एक mask है, और mask के रूप में ये publish हुआ था when in his second period, Harten period में। Right? And the full title of Camus was A Mask Presented at Ludlow Castle in 1634. A Mask Presented at Ludlow Castle. Castle means palace. Ludlow Castle, 1634. Right? It is a mask in honor of chastity. Right? The mask is in honor of chastity, written by Milton, and it was presented in 1634 before John Egerton, the first Earl of Bridgewater, at Ludlow Castle in the celebration of Earl's new post as Lord President of Wales. Right? तो Lord President of Wales बनाए गए थे जॉर्ज आज है जॉन इगर्टन, और उन्हीं के ऑनर में इस मास्क को 1634 में परफॉर्म किया गया था। क्लियर? तो ये इसकी छोटी सी स्टोरी है। एंड Ludlow Castle was the name of the building, and Camus is a Greek character, right? Camus एक ग्रीक कैरेक्टर है, और ग्रीक से इन्होंने जो है कामू को बारो किया है। Known colloquially as Camus, the mask's actual full title in its first publication is A Mask Presented at Ludlow Castle, 1634. It was first performed for the Earl of Bridgewater on 29th September 1634. Camus was printed anonymously in 1637. Right? 1637 में anonymously publish हुआ था। और अगर प्लॉट की बात करें, then the plot concerns two brothers and their sister, simply called a lady, lost in a journey through the woods. The lady becomes fatigued and the brothers wander off in search of sustenance. While alone, she counters the debauched Kamu, a character inspired by the god of rivalry, who is disguised as a villager and claims he will lead her to her brothers. Or deceived by his amiable countenance, the lady follows him only to be captured, brought to his pleasure palace, and victimized by his necromancy. Seated on an enchanted chair with gums of gluttonous heat, she is immobilized, and Kamu accosts her while with one hand he holds a necromancer's wand and with the other he offers a vessel with a drink that would overpower her. Kamu urges the lady to be not coy and drink from his magical cup, representing sexual pleasure and intemperance. But she repeatedly refuses, arguing for the virtuousness of temperance and chastity. Within view, at his palace, is an array of cuisine intended to arouse the lady's appetites and desires. Despite being restrained against her will, she continues to exercise right reason in her deputation with Kamu, thereby manifesting her freedom of mind. Whereas the would-be seducer argues appetites and desires issuing from one's nature are natural and therefore illicit. The lady contends that the only rational self-control is enlightened and virtuous. To be self-indulgent and intemperate, she adds, is to forfeit one's higher nature and to yield to baser impulses. In this debate, the lady and Kamu signify respectively soul and body, ratio and libido, sublimation and sensuality, virtue and vice, moral rectitude and immoral depravity. In line with the theme of the journey that distinguishes Kamu, the lady has been deceived by the guile of a treacherous character, temporarily waylaid and besieged by sophistry that is disguised as wisdom. और meanwhile, जो brothers होते हैं, searching for her, come across the attendant spirit, an angelic figure sent to aid them, who takes the form of a shepherd and tells them how to defeat Kamu. As the lady continues to assert her freedom of mind and to exercise her free will by resistance and even defiance, she is rescued by the attendant spirit along with her brothers, who chases off Kamu. The lady remains magically wound to her chair. With the song, the spirit conjures the water nymph Sabrina, who frees the lady on account of her steadfast virtue. She and her brothers are reunited with their parents in a triumphal celebration, which signifies the heavenly bliss awaiting the wayfaring soul that prevails over trials and travails. Whether these are the threats of posts are over by overt evil or the blandishments of temptation, but finally the lady overcomes all the temptations, all the magical wounds, and all the superpowers created and thrown upon her by Kamu. And finally she is rescued, and that's why I told you Kamu is a mask in honor of chastity, in honor of virginity. And finally, Kamu is a mask. Kamu is a duel between virtue and vice, between morality and immorality, between chastity and जो है sexuality. Right? इन्हीं पर एक पूरा वो जो है discussion होता है, पूरा description होता है. Right? And that's why I told कि had Milton not written anything else, only his 4 poems, El Allegro, Il Penseroso, Lycidas and Camus, would have made him very much famous. Right? उनको उतना ही famous वो कर दी होती. And the last work of the Horton period is an elegy, and that elegy is known as Lycidas. Lycidas once again is a Greek name. एक बार फिर Greek. Actually Milton was a high scholar and he had learnt everything by heart. सब कुछ उनको याद था, सब कुछ के एक्सपर्ट थे और इसलिए उनके लिए तो जो है क्वाइन करना, बनाना, यूज करना किसी थीम को बहुत ही आसान था. Lycidas is the poem by Milton written in 1637 as a pastoral elegy. Published in 1638, and the elegy was written and dedicated to the memory of Edward King, a friend of Milton at Cambridge. Dedicated to Edward King, a friend of Milton, right? And during his studies time in Cambridge, right? Who drowned when his ship sank in the Irish Sea. Irish Sea में उनकी शिप डूब जाती है और उनकी डेथ हो जाती है, राइट, अगस्त 1637 में. एंड देन ही रोट द एलिजी. द पोएम इज 193 lines in length and is irregularly rhymed. Many of the other poems in compilation are in Greek and Latin, but Lycidas is one of the poems written in English. Milton republished the poem in 1645, right? 1638 में एक एंथोलॉजी पब्लिश हुई थी मिल्टन की और उसी में ये पोयम थी. ये देख उसमें बहुत सारी पोएम्स ग्रीक और लैटिन में थी, बट लिसिडस वाज इन इंग्लिश. एंड लिसिडस इज अ पास्टोरल एलिजी written in memory of and dedicated to Edward King, his childhood friend, his Cambridge friend, who drowned in Irish Sea in August 1637. What is a pastoral elegy? It is also a very important question. In a pastoral elegy, a shepherd laments the death of another shepherd. एक शेफर्ड दूसरे शेफर्ड की डेथ को लैमेंट कर रहा होता है, उसकी डेथ पर रो रहा होता है. और नॉट ओनली मिल्टन बट बिफोर मिल्टन, Sir Edmund Spenser hath written a pastoral elegy in memory of his contemporary poet and friend Sir Philip Sidney. और सर फिलिप सिडनी के मेमोरी में स्पेंसर ने जो एलिजी लिखा था वो भी पास्टोरल एलिजी है. और उस एलिजी का नाम क्या था जो स्पेंसर ने लिखा था? किसके लिए? स्पेंसर ने सर फिलिप सिडनी के लिए लिखा था और उस एलिजी का नाम था एस्ट्रोफल. Right, Astrophel and Stella was a sequence of sonnets by Sir Philip Sidney, and after his death, Edmund Spenser wrote an elegy under the title, under the name Astrophel. And after Milton, right, there are several writers, several poets who practiced Shakespeare, who practiced Milton's style. और इनके बाद pastoral elegy में ही अगर आप जाएं तो pastoral elegy was written on the death of Keats by P.B. Shelley, and the name of that जो है elegy is Adonis. And then Matthew Arnold wrote pastoral elegies on the death of his own father under the name Rugby Chapel, and then he wrote another elegy, Thyrsis, after the death of his own friend, right, Arthur Hughes Clow. और उसके बाद जो है Matthew Arnold was the expert in writing elegies. He wrote Scholar Gypsy, that is also pastoral elegy. right? And he also wrote memorial verses, that is also an elegy on the death of Wordsworth, Goethe and Byron, right? So pastoral elegy, in a pastoral elegy आप lament होता है एक shepherd का, a shepherd laments the death of another shepherd, right? एक shepherd दूसरे shepherd की death पर lament कर रहा होता है, उसकी death पर रो रहा होता है। और यहाँ पर एडवर्ड किंग उसका खुद का फ्रेंड है जिसकी डेथ हो गई है बाय ड्राउनिंग इन द आयरिश सी, एंड देन ही रोट द पोएम, राइट, लिसिडस। Edward King was intended for the church and thought that such a promising young career should be cut short makes Milton thinks of himself. He wonders whether it would not have been better for him to enjoy himself like others than to engage in incessant toil to achieve fame as a great poet. But he consoled with the thought that the real reward for one's labor is given by God, not by man. Right after this personal digression comes the procession of mourners, of whom Saint Peter is one, which are the thought of the church fills Milton with anger and disgust, which are expressed in Saint Peter's outburst against the corrupt clergy. What a pity, he says, that a sincere and talented young man like King should die, and self-indulgent and mercenary priests should creep and intrude and climb into the fold. But Nemesis, he prophesies, is near at hand and will overtake him. और उसके बाद जो उनका थर्ड पीरियड शुरू होता है, और वो थर्ड पीरियड है जर्नलिस्टिक पीरियड, राइट। एक्चुअली मिल्टन के एक बहुत बड़े क्रिटिक थे डॉक्टर सैमुअल जॉनसन। डॉक्टर सैमुअल जॉनसन इज नोन एज लिटरेरी डिक्टेटर, और ही डिडंट लीव एनीवन जिसको उन्होंने क्रिटिसाइज न किया हो, और मिल्टन को खूब क्रिटिसाइज किया था जो है डॉक्टर सैमुअल जॉनसन ने, और अप्रिशिएट भी किया है उनके थोड़े से पोर्शन के लिए, पैराडाइज लॉस्ट के लिए, नहीं तो क्रिटिसिज्म के लिए ही जाने जाते हैं। टू द objection of that Lycidas is not an expression of intense personal grief. The answer is that King was not an intimate friend of Milton, and Lycidas was only his formal contribution to the collection of many obituary verses written by King's friends on the occasion. Right? Edward King was in fact not his intimate friend, but after his death, his many friends contributed, wrote elegies in memory of Edward King, और उसी में से एक ये भी है, right? Critics who take exception to Milton's attack on the hiring clergy are stronger on ground that Milton, the Puritan controversialist, should make his appearance for the first time in a professed elegy that seem old. It certainly doesn't add to the beauty of the poem. Dr. Johnson's charge that the poem is artificial. डॉक्टर सैमुअल जॉनसन ने लिसिडस पोएम को ही आर्टिफिशियल बताया है, बिकॉज ऑफ इट्स पास्टोरल कन्वेंशन इज टू सिली टू बी टेकन सीरियसली. मिल्टन वाज सिंपली फॉलोइंग वेल एस्टैब्लिश्ड आर्टिस्टिक precedent, a precedent that has given us Arnold's Thyrsis and Shelley's Adonis, right? And when the journalistic period starts, then we have sonnets. To this period of 20 years, from 1640 to 1660, belong Milton's prose pamphlets, which are considered elsewhere, right, and a few sonnets. The sonnets are Italian in form and occasional in subject. Right, on his attaining 23rd year, his assault on London, on his second wife, on his blindness, on the massacre of Pediment, the last two being the most famous. Unlike the Elizabethans, he didn't write love sonnets Milton's sonnets are as individual as his other works. They are original, lofty in thought, learned and high sounding. As Wordsworth said, the sonnet in Milton's hand became a trumpet. Right? From 1640 to 1660 ये जो उनका पीरियड है ये उनके प्रोज वर्क के लिए जाना जाता है। आइए देखते हैं कि कौन कौन से प्रोज वर्क्स मिल्टन के हैं जो उन्होंने 1660 से लेकर के और 1640 से लेकर के और 1660 तक लिखा है। मतलब ये है कि उनके क्या कंट्रीब्यूशन है टू द फील्ड ऑफ जर्नल्स एंड एसेज। राइट, उन्होंने क्या क्या काम किया है। आइए शुरू करते हैं। Milton's pamphlets. First, let's know about Milton's divorce tracts. Milton's divorce tracts. Divorce tracts refer to the four interlinked polemical pamphlets: the doctrine and discipline of divorce, the doctrine and discipline of divorce. This one is the first tract of the series, the judgment of Martin Bucer. The judgment of Martin Bucer. This is the second one. The third one is called Tetrachordon. Tetrachordon, and the fourth one is called Colastrian. Written between 1643 and 1645. These four tracts are known as divorce tracts. Arguing for divorce at all, let alone a version of no fault divorce, was extremely controversial, and religious figures sought to ban his tracts. Although the tracts were met with nothing but hostility and he later rued publishing them in English at all, they are important for analyzing the relationship between Adam and Eve in his epic Paradise Lost. Milton's Prose work, prose writings includes 25 pamphlets written in English and Latin. Right, 25 pamphlets में से ये उनके 4 pamphlets जो हैं इनको कहा जाता है मिल्टन के डिवोर्स ट्रैक्ट्स. राइट, मिल्टन के ये डिवोर्स के ट्रैक्ट्स हैं. कंटेक्स्ट की अगर हम जो है बात करें तो द इमीडिएट स्पार्क ऑफ मिल्टन्स राइटिंग ऑफ द ट्रैक्ट्स was his desertion by his newly married wife मैरी पावेल. राइट, उनकी खुद की वाइफ थी मैरी पावेल और मैरी पावेल हैड डिसर्टेड हिम, इनको छोड़ करके चली गई थी. इन एडिशन टू द टेस्टिमनी ऑफ अर्ली बायोग्राफर्स, critics have detected Milton's personal psychosexual situation in passages of the Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce. However, Milton's commonplace book reveals that he had been thinking about divorce beforehand, a fact that qualifies the biographical explanation. The full title of the first pamphlet, The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, restored the good of both sexes from the bondage of canon law. Its first edition was printed in 1643 and then a much expanded, also unlicensed second edition came out in 1644. Or Milton's full name appeared on neither title page. He did sign the epistle to the Parliament of England. जो जजमेंट ऑफ मार्टिन बुसर है, it was published in 1644. और Martin Bucer was a German Protestant reformer, and by finding support for his views among Protestant writers, Milton hoped to sway his other members of parliaments and Protestant ministers who had condemned him. Among Milton's divorce tracts, this is the only one that obtained a pre-publication license. जो थर्ड है जिसका नाम है टेट्राकॉर्डिन, ये 1645 में आया है. आफ्टर मिल्टन हैड पब्लिश्ड हिज डिफेंस ऑफ फ्री स्पीच एरोपेजेटिका, जो मतलब होता है टेट्राकॉर्डिन का. टेट्राकॉर्डिन ग्रीक टर्म है. टेट्रा मीन्स होता है 4 और कॉर्डिन मीन्स होता है स्ट्रिंग्ड. राइट, द टाइटल मीन्स 4 strings in Greek, implying that Milton was able to harmonize the 4 scriptural passages dealing with divorce. राइट, और जो लास्ट वाला है जिसका नाम है कोलेस्ट्रियन, इसका मतलब होता है रॉड ऑफ पनिशमेंट इन ग्रीक. द ब्रीफ कोलेस्ट्रियन वाज पब्लिश्ड along with tetracordin in March 1645 in response to an anonymous pamphlet attacking the first edition of Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce. Right, and all these tracts were written in English. Right, सब के सब इंग्लिश में लिखे गए थे. Tracts means pamphlets. Right, tracts means pamphlets. And apart from these 4 divorce tracts, in the same period, Milton also wrote Areopagitica. Milton also wrote Areopagitica. Areopagitica actually in 1643. The British Parliament had banned the publication. एक एक्ट आया था जिसको लाइसेंसिंग एक्ट के नाम से जाना जाता है, और उस लाइसेंसिंग एक्ट के अगेंस्ट मिल्टन हैड डिलीवर्ड ए स्पीच इन द पार्लियामेंट, और उस स्पीच का नाम है एरोपेजेटिका. AREOPAGITICA. Areopagitica, a speech of Mr. John Milton. A speech of Mr. John Milton. A speech of Mr. John Milton for the liberty of for the liberty of unlicensed printing for the liberty of unlicensed printing to the Parliament of England. To the Parliament of England in 1644. This was the complete title of the work, Areopagitica, written in 1644, and it was a prose polemic by the English poet, scholar, and polemical author John Milton, opposing licensing act and censorship. प्रेस के ऊपर जो सेंसरशिप लगा दी गई थी कि विदाउट प्रायर परमिशन ऑफ द पार्लियामेंट नो वर्क कैन बी पब्लिश्ड, कुछ भी पब्लिश नहीं किया जा सकता है। और उसी जिसको लाइसेंसिंग एक्ट कहा गया था, लाइसेंस लेना होता था पब्लिकेशन के लिए, उसी लाइसेंसिंग एक्ट के खिलाफ मिल्टन ने पार्लियामेंट में एक स्पीच डिलीवर की थी और उसी स्पीच का नाम है एरोपेजेटिका। बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चन है एरोपेजेटिका कि विच वर्क इज नोन फॉर द फ्रीडम ऑफ प्रेस। फ्रीडम ऑफ प्रेस के लिए एरोपेजेटिका लिखा था उन्होंने, जैसे कि लिखा है फॉर द लिबर्टी, लिबर्टी मीन्स फ्रीडम ऑफ अनलाइसेंस्ड प्रिंटिंग, अनलाइसेंस्ड प्रिंटिंग को लिबर्टी दे दी जाए, इसके लिए जो एक उन्होंने एरोपेजिटिका नाम से एक स्पीच डिलीवर की थी पार्लियामेंट में 1644 में। जर्नलिस्टिक पीरियड का मतलब ही होता है कि व्हेन ही वाज वर्किंग लाइक अ जर्नलिस्ट, व्हेन ही वाज वर्किंग लाइक अ प्रेसमैन, व्हेन ही वाज वर्किंग लाइक अ रिपोर्टर, राइट। एक्चुअली द फर्स्ट 4 एसेज जिसकी हमने बात की, जिनको डिवोर्स ट्रैक्ट्स कहा जाता है, जो तलाक के ऊपर उन्होंने लिखा था, he himself was engaged in divorce. Actually his wife Mary Powell, first wife जो थी इनकी, had deserted him without giving him divorce, बिना तलाक दिए ही चली गई थी। तो he was affected with that जो है desertion, और इसलिए जो है he focused on the current issue, और करंट जो टॉपिक था वो था डिवोर्स। और फिर जब लाइसेंसिंग एक्ट आता है तो उस लाइसेंसिंग एक्ट के अगेंस्ट मिल्टन काम करना शुरू करते हैं, एंड देन ही रोट एरोपेजिटिका। और यहाँ पर जो है उन्होंने सरकार से, पार्लियामेंट से ये रिक्वेस्ट किया था कि लाइसेंसिंग एक्ट को खत्म कर दिया जाए। यद्यपि उनकी बात सुनी नहीं गई और लाइसेंसिंग एक्ट को खत्म नहीं किया गया। एरोपेजिटिका is among history's most influential and impassioned philosophical defenses of the principle of a right to freedom of speech and expression, right? Freedom of speech and freedom of expression को बैन कर देना, it was a crime in the view of, in the eyes of John Milton, और इसलिए मिल्टन was against licensing act, और इसलिए उन्होंने एक स्पीच डिलीवर की थी पार्लियामेंट में, उसी को एरोपेजिटिका के नाम से जाना जाता है। क्लियर है? तो आज की क्लास के लिए थैंक यू। नेक्स्ट क्लास में हम बात करेंगे मिल्टन के 2 और वर्क्स आज जो प्रोज में है, जो उन्होंने आफ्टर द असैसिनेशन ऑफ चार्ल्स फर्स्ट लिखा था। एक का नाम है द टेन्योर्स ऑफ इंग्लिश किंग्स एंड मजिस्ट्रेट्स, और फिर एक है आइकनोक्लास्ट, and then Milton's sonnet When I Consider How My Light Is Spent, and then his magnum opus Paradise Lost, and all the 12 books of the Paradise Lost will be discussed, and the questions asked by UGC on Milton's work, and then Paradise Regained and Samson Agonist will also not be left untouched. Thank you for today's class. Thank you for your paying attention. All the best. Good luck.